Well, tonight I'm going to do something maybe a little bit different, but in some ways maybe not so different. We're going to talk a bit of a Bible biography. In fact, that was the first thing that I wrote down as I prepared this sermon, a biography of somebody in the Bible. And there's a lot of well-known Bible characters, and there's also a lot of lesser-known Bible characters. You could throw out some names, and people might be pretty unfamiliar with who's mentioned there. And tonight, actually, I would not consider the person that we're talking about to really be a minor Bible character. This person is actually pretty important in the pages of Scripture. There's at least 2 full chapters dedicated, and his name is scattered throughout much of the book of Genesis. But he's somebody that I feel gets overshadowed by other people's story who's being told simultaneously with him. And this person is Judah. Now, when you hear of Judah, a lot of times you're going to hear him entirely in the context of the story of Joseph, his brother. And we can't obviously leave that out. We'll be looking at Joseph tonight. But we're going to focus on Judah. And so we may see some things that you otherwise might miss if you were just noticing Judah as you read through the story of Joseph. And so if you think, that is one that I missed in Sunday school, if somebody came up and told me to tell the story of Judah, I encourage you to listen carefully tonight, and hopefully I intend to try to cover, with the time that I have, the story of Judah, give the full Bible biography. And maybe there's some good reason why his story is maybe not the first one that pops into your head. It's not the first one you probably want your kids learning in Sunday school, but it is a great story of a life turned around. And so if there were a title, I kind of thought I could just say Bible biography Judah, but I did think, as you think of his life as a whole, what would be something that you would consider him? And I said, well, he's Judah, the repentant hypocrite. And so first we're going to start with his background story. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 29. And we'll be sticking pretty close to Genesis here and just moving through the book. There are 50 chapters in Genesis, and really chapter 29 is where you start to have any inkling of the story. Now, Abraham, as you know, he had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob married 2 sisters, and the older one, Leah, realized that Jacob didn't love her as much as his sister Rachel. I'm sorry, I said Abraham. Of course, we're talking about Isaac. And Leah seeks acceptance from her husband when she bears him children. We have Jacob, and we have Jacob's first wife, Leah. And really, Leah, if you know that story, she kind of snuck in as a wife, whether it was entirely by her father's deception or whether it was by her own deception. It seems like probably a bit of each. But she's the first wife, but just a mere week after she was Jacob's first wife, then he has a second wife whom he loves more. And so Leah is always looking for acceptance from her husband. And here in Genesis chapter 29, starting verse 30, we read this. And he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. Serves with Laban is what it's referring there, so he can have Rachel. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, that means loved less, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And Leah conceived and bare a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, Surely the Lord hath looked upon my affliction, now therefore my husband will love me. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, Because the Lord hath heard that I was hated, he hath therefore given me this son also. And she called his name Simeon. And she conceived again, and bare a son, and said, Now this time will my husband be joined unto me, because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore was his name called Levi. Now what you notice, and what ends up happening is Jacob has 12 sons, but Leah is the first person to have these 3 children to start with. So Rachel's there in the scene, but she's not having children. And Leah, she is putting her trust in having children to make her husband love her. But ultimately, we see a little bit of a change with the 4th son. She decides to put her trust in God rather than her husband. In verse 35, and she conceived again and bare a son, and she said, Now I will praise the Lord. Therefore, she called his name Judah and left bearing. And the name Judah means praise. That's the meaning of this little baby boy who's born. Now, Judah's birth is told in Genesis 29, and we don't hear his name again until chapter 35. But a lot does happen in the meantime that will affect his life. So turn over to chapter 30 then. In chapter 30 we see, and I won't read through this, but you can see Rachel and Leah bearing children, and then ultimately each of them also give their handmaids to Jacob and have more children that way. And it's basically a family dispute here to try to make their husband love them, which goes to show that polygamy is a recipe for family disaster and favoritism, and you see all of that in Jacob's family. But Jacob left the promised land, ultimately, to go to Laban and find his wives. And we find in chapter 31, then, that Jacob and his family leave Laban and decide to come back to the promised land, which is a good sign for Jacob that he is willing to come back to the promised land. He still has some trust in the promises given to his grandfather and to his father. And so that's a promising thing. But we also see that Rachel brings her idols with her. And so now, not only is Judah being raised in a polygamous household, but also in a polytheistic one. And Rachel still has an eye on her father's idols. In chapter 32, we find out that Esau is actually going to come to meet Jacob. Esau lives down near the promised land, and so as Jacob comes down into the Transjordan, Esau sends a group of people, comes with a group of people to apparently fight with him. And this is what Jacob does. Notice this in chapter 32, verses 6 through 8. The messengers returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to thy brother Esau, and also he cometh to meet thee, and 400 men with him." Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that was with him, and the flocks and herds and the camels into 2 bands, and said, "If Esau come to the one company and smite it, then the other company which is left shall escape." Now initially you say, okay, not a bad plan, until you see how it's executed. In chapter 33, verses 1 and 2, "And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and beheld, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men, and he divided the children unto Leah, and unto Rachel, and unto the 2 handmaids, and he put the handmaids and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost." So immediately it's quite apparent in this family who's the favored ones. All right, first, the children of the handmaids, Esau gets here first with his men, they'll slaughter those guys. And then at least I'll still have Rachel and Leah's children. And if he gets past, well, then he can have Leah and her children and kill all those. And then maybe me and Rachel, we can run away like I always wanted it to be in the first place. This is kind of what you see about Jacob here. So imagine Judah in this situation. He knows he's the second-class son. He's one being left to be destroyed while dad runs away with his favorite wife and kids. And this is the setting in which Judah's growing up. But in chapter 33, we find Esau actually meets Jacob on friendly terms, and the whole decision of Jacob to divide his family up like this was pointless. It was worthless. He caused all this strife in his family for ultimately no purpose. But still, Judah isn't mentioned by name. In the next 2 chapters, though, some very important things happen that will affect this man's life. So in chapter 34, in verse number 2, we find that Judah's full sister, Dinah, which is the only sister that's actually mentioned. Probably there were a lot of sisters, but her name is mentioned in the narrative and in the genealogies because her story is told here, and it's important. She's raped by a Canaanite man named Shechem, and Jacob does nothing about it. And because of this, 2 of Dinah's brothers take things into their own hands and say, we're going to get revenge. In chapter 34, verse 25, it says, "And it came to pass on the 3rd day when they were sore that 2 of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword and came upon the city boldly and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and spoiled the city because they had defiled their sister." Now, of the 7 children that were born to Jacob and Leah particularly, which is pretty interesting to notice, of the 12 sons, 7 of them are Jacob and Leah, a good portion, more than half. The order is, as we saw, Reuben first, then Simeon second, then Levi third, and then Judah fourth. Dinah is also one of the children of Leah and Jacob. She's not from Bilhah or Zilpah or Rachel. And so Jacob's family here is divided into two different factions. Two of Leah's sons defend their sister, and they kill an entire city. And because of this, the second and third in line to leadership in the family, we find, disqualify themselves. Now, they give a good argument. They say, to their father, when he questions them, they say, well, were you going to do anything about it? Jacob obviously should have done something about it, but their result of killing an entire city was not what they should have done. And we see this in chapter 34, verse 30 and 31. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have troubled me to make me stink among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And I, being few in number, they shall gather themselves together against me and slay me. And I shall be destroyed, I and my house." And they said, "Should he deal with our sister as with a harlot?" And then, almost as a side note, we read this in Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, as we move forward in the story of this family. It says, "And it came to pass when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah his father's concubine, and Israel heard it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. So just a very short footnote there. Reuben, the firstborn, also disqualifies himself from leadership in the family. So with this event, Judah, the fourth-born, is now in line to be the leader of the family when his father dies. So although we haven't seen his name for a little while, we've learned some things about the situation he's going to be in. And then secondly, let's talk about his character revealed. So we saw some things that may have affected Judah's character, but people can respond differently to things. And some of the same things that happened to Judah happened to Joseph or happened to the other brothers, and they didn't all respond the same way. But in chapter 37, we begin to see what Judah is like, starting here in verse number 3. "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his children, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a coat of many colors. And when his brethren saw that their father loved him more than all his brethren, they hated him, and could not speak peaceably unto him. And Joseph dreamed a dream, and he told it unto his brethren, and they hated him yet the more." So Daddy Jacob's favoritism is once again here in the scene, and Judah is doubtless one of these brethren who now hates Joseph and hates him yet the more in verse number 5. And then in verses number 9 through 11, "And he dreamed yet another dream, and told it unto his brethren, and said, Behold, I have dreamed a dream more, and behold, the sun and moon and the 11 stars made obeisance to me. And he told it to his father and to his brethren, and his father rebuked him, and said unto him, What is this dream that thou hast dreamed? Shall I and thy mother and thy brethren indeed come to bow down ourselves to thee and to the earth? And his brethren envied him, but his father observed the saying." So now there's also envy in this family, and Judah doubtless is one of these people who has envy. And now, following that, happens probably the most well-known story in the life of Judah's brother Joseph, which is the story of him being sold into slavery. And you know this story. Jacob tells his son Joseph to go check on the other brothers who are off at quite a long distance away. And so Joseph arrives, his brothers throw him in a pit, and we see Reuben actually convinces the brothers not to kill Joseph. This is right here in the next chapter, 37, the same chapter we were just looking at, verse number 22. "And Reuben said unto them, Shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that is in the wilderness, and lay no hand upon him, that he might rid him out of their hands to deliver to his father again." And then, in the middle of this story, for the first time in the pages of Scripture, Judah speaks. Here's what he has to say. We see the story starting in verse 25. "They sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes and looked, and behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery and balm and myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. And Judah said unto his brethren, What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come and let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content." So Judah's first words in the pages of Scripture are, let's not kill him, let's sell him into slavery. And then he says, after all, he is our brother, so let's just sell him into slavery. Let's not kill him. What an honor for somebody who's your own flesh. Now, despite his poor character, which is pretty obvious in this situation, we do see him as the leader. He's not leading in a good way, but he is being a leader in this situation. And the deed being done, the following verses immediately show up that tell us a little bit more about Judah. So we just saw through verse 27 of chapter 37. And in verse 38, or chapter 38, verses 1 through 5, it says, "It came to pass at that time that Judah went down from his brethren." down from his brethren, and turned into a certain Adullamite whose name was Hira. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in unto her, and she conceived and bare a son, and he called his name And she conceived again and bare a son, and he called his name Onan. And she yet again conceived and bare a son, and called his name Shelah, and he was at Chezib when she bare him. So what happens here? It's easy to miss it, but in verse 1 it says that Judah went down from his brethren. Judah leaves the family. And you can imagine maybe why. So the brothers, right before this, they tell their father about Joseph's presumed death. And we find that Jacob mourns for many days over Joseph. And perhaps at this point, Judah begins to feel some regret. And he begins to see how this has actually changed things in his father. His father is not the same. There's just not the same feeling in the house anymore. You know, they've been 12 brothers, but now it's always obvious. There's one fewer, and there's Dad with his heart broken. And Judah helped to break his father's heart. And maybe he just can't stand to see Dad this way. His conscience is eating at him. And so right after this story of Joseph being sold into slavery, he leaves the family. And leaving is a big deal. This is the chosen family. This is the children of Israel. This is where God ultimately, from each of these men, is going to choose to have a different tribe in Israel. This is where he's going to have his chosen nation. And here's what you see instead. In chapter 38, verse 12, he went up to his sheep shearers to Timnath, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. So in verse number 1, we see he turned into the Adullamite whose name was Hira, this Canaanite man. And now in chapter 38, verse 12, we find best friend Hira the Adullamite. What's happening is Judah is no longer hanging out with the children of God and with the children of Abraham. He's actually at risk of being assimilated into the Canaanites and not even being part of the chosen family anymore. What a big deal to leave the family. And also another interesting thing is that he's behaving a lot like his uncle. Remember? Uncle Esau? Esau hated his brother, and he sold his birthright. Judah, he sold his brother. That's what he did. He's behaving like Uncle Esau. Like Esau did when he wanted to spite his parents after not receiving the blessing. What did he do? He went out immediately and started marrying Canaanite women. Well, Judah now also marries a Canaanite woman. Jacob had intentionally moved back to the promised land to fulfill the promises that God had given to Abraham, but Judah, he's following the path of Esau, and he leaves the promised land and leaves the family. He's endangering his place in the chosen people. But then number 3, his hypocrisy discovered. Chapter 38, we get to the story of Judah and Tamar, and it's not the most popular Bible story, and it also has some complexities that can make it kind of difficult to understand. So I'm not going to read the whole passage through, but let me summarize the story that takes place. In verses 1 through 5 of chapter 38, we see Judah and his 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. And then verses 36 through 38 say, And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, whose name was Tamar. And Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord slew him. And Judah said unto Onan, Go in unto thy brother's wife, and marry her, and raise up seed to thy brother. So Judah has his first son. She gets married to a woman named Tamar. That son is wicked. We don't know exactly what the situation is, but God kills him. And then Judah goes and tells his son Onan, his second son, to go marry Tamar. Now, you might think that's a little bit weird, but there's a reason for this suggestion here. This is something called levirate marriage. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 5, in the Mosaic Law, which is still in the future at this point, it says this, If brethren dwell together, and one of them die, and have no child, the wife of the dead shall not marry without unto a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go in unto her, and take her to him to wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother unto her. And the term that's used for this in biblical scholarship is levirate marriage. And levirate marriage helps us to understand a few things. It helps us to understand this story, why Judah gives the next son after is killed without having any children. But it also makes the story of the woman with 7 husbands in Luke chapter 20, verse 27 through 33 make more sense, right? That story, we hear about a woman who was married and her first husband dies, and so she takes the next brother, and he dies and takes the next brother. It's a story that's being given by the Sadducees to Jesus to try to cause him a question about who people are married to in heaven. But it actually, to us, it sounds, boy, what a ridiculous story. But it's following the principle of levirate marriage. If one dies, then the next child would actually come into place. And so the next son would have to marry. So this is not all that strange of a story in that context. And the whole reason for levirate marriage is actually for the protection of the woman involved. She was a widow. She had no children. And this is back in the time when, if you don't have some men in the family, then you're going to starve to death or have to resort to prostitution in order to survive. So Judah did right in giving his second son to Tamar, but then Onan refused to do his job. Because the whole point is, once again, the son is supposed to then, the next son is to be given and give children to this woman so she can live. And Onan, he publicly appears to do his job. He accepts the idea of being married to Tamar, and people think that he's fulfilling his levirate responsibility to raise up children. And he does satisfy his lust on Tamar, but then he interrupts the marital act and refuses to let her have any children. So God kills Onan too. In Genesis 38:10, the thing which he did displeased the Lord, wherefore he slew him also. But Judah has 3 sons. And there's one more son then, because, once again, second son gave no children to this woman. So there's another son who needs to be given. In chapter 38, verse 11, it says, Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, Remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah, my son, be grown. The verse goes on to tell us, though, that Judah never intended to actually give the last son. He's a little suspicious of this situation. I've given 2 sons already. I only have one left. I don't know what Tamar's, putting into the oatmeal each morning, but people don't seem to come out of this situation alive. And so he says in chapter 38, verse 11, Lest peradventure he die also, as his brethren did, and Tamar went and dwelt at his father's house. So over time, Tamar realizes that Judah actually has no intention of giving Shelah to her, and so Tamar takes matters into her own hands. In verses 12 through 13, she finds out that Judah is going to this city called Timnath to go to perhaps what was a sheep shearing festival. And so in verse 14, she disguises herself as a harlot and sits on the roadside where she knew Judah would have to pass by. We see this in chapter 38, starting in verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot because she had covered her face. And he turned unto her by the way and said, Go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee, for he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What wilt thou give me that thou mayest come in unto me? And he said, I will send thee a kid from the flock. And she said, Wilt thou give me a pledge till thou send it? And he said, What pledge shall I give thee? And she said, Thy signet, and thy bracelets, and thy staff that is in thine hand. And he gave it to her, and came in unto her, and she conceived by him. And she arose and went away, and laid by her veil from her, and put on the garments of her widowhood. So Judah comes and just assumes that she's a regular harlot, and he gives her 2 items to prove he's later going to pay her. And these are actually items that are very good at identifying a person. Everybody knew Judah's staff. Everybody knew his signet ring. This is giving his ID to Tamar. He says, I'll come back. Then we find in verses 20 through 23 that Judah doesn't even go himself back to pay her. He was willing to go there himself and to solicit a prostitute, but he was a little bit too proper to actually go back to pay her. So he sends Hira, that guy who's his friend. He sends Hira along to go and make the payment. But Tamar isn't there. She holds on to Judah's ID, and she stays back at home because she's going to need that for what happens next in the story. But one interesting thing here is that Tamar knew Judah's character. Again, we get a look into the character of Judah, because why is Tamar so confident that this plan is going to work? Tamar goes and dresses as a harlot and sits by the roadside, and it does work because she knows that what kind of a man Judah is. We see this then in chapter 38, starting in verse 24. It came to pass about 3 months after that it was told Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot. And also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, Bring her forth, and let her be burnt. When she was brought forth, she sent to her father-in-law, saying, By the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet, and bracelets, and staff. And Judah acknowledged them and said, She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more. So Judah is told of his daughter-in-law's infidelity because technically she's still engaged to Judah's youngest son. And then Judah, what a hypocrite. He demands the death penalty on her for not just the same type of sin that he committed, but for the actual very same act of sin that he himself had committed. And Judah, the one who had so long hid his sin, over killing his brother, or actually making it look like his brother was dead, but actually just selling him into slavery, he had hidden that sin. He thinks, nobody knows about that. He's in for quite an emotional surprise in this situation, because notice what happens. In Genesis 38:25, when she was brought forth, he sent to her father-in-law, saying, By the man whose these are am I with child. And she said, Discern, I pray thee, whose are these, the signet and bracelets and staff? Something you might miss here is that the same Hebrew words are used in this situation as a similar presentation a couple chapters back. In Genesis 37:32, and they sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, This have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. It's the same thing. Here they are. Here's the coat. Do you know whose coat this is? Here's the ring, the signet ring. Here's the staff. Do you know whose these are? Judah probably, when he heard that revelation being made right in front of him with the kind of underhanded statement, do you have any idea whose this is, brings back to mind the same sin that he had recently committed with his own brother. And this seems to actually be a turning point for Judah in his life. He had resented his father's favoritism. He'd behaved like Uncle Esau. He married a Canaanite. He raised his children poorly. And then he refused to give his son to Tamar. But now his sin had come to find him out. And how does he respond? And Judah acknowledged in verse 26 them and said, She hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah my son, and he knew her again no more. So Judah, he was still the man in control. He could have had her, he could have said she's lying and had her put aside or executed or charged her with theft, but he repented in this case. He admitted his own sin. Now, of course, Tamar's behavior wasn't right. The ends don't justify the means, but God will be the judge of that. But in this situation now, Tamar is pregnant, and we see an unusual birth story. Here in chapter 38, verse 28, It came to pass when she travailed that one put out his hand, and the midwife took and bound upon his hand a scarlet thread. This is the birth story. She has twins. One stuck out his hand, and they put a scarlet thread on it. Verse 29, It came to pass he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. And she said, How hast thou broken forth? This breach be upon thee. Therefore his name was called Pharez, and afterward came out his brother that had the scarlet thread upon his hand, and his name was called Zerah. What an interesting conclusion to this story of Judah and Tamar, and does it sound familiar at all? Because there's a parallel, once again, to Uncle Esau and Daddy Jacob's birth story. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 21, it says, And Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived, and the children struggled together within her. And she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other people, and the elder shall serve the younger. So a similar situation here with, who should have been the elder son. He was about to be born, and he drew his hand back, and another is born first. Now, the next few chapters here in the book of Genesis are back to the story of Joseph. Years pass before we get to see anything else about Judah and who he's become, but then we get to chapter number 42. And in chapter 42, we read there's a famine, but due to Joseph's leadership, there's plenty of food in Egypt. So 10 brothers go to Egypt to get food. Now, of course, we know that Jacob had 12 sons, but one's presumed dead, that's Joseph, and the other one was kept home because Daddy still has a favorite son, and that's Benjamin. It's the only alive son of Rachel, as far as he knows. In chapter 42, verse 7, Joseph sees his brothers have come to Egypt, and he doesn't reveal who he is. In verse 13, the brothers admit that they're 12 12 in total, but they say one's back with Dad. And in verse 14, Joseph decides to test them, and he accuses them of being spies. In verse 15, hereby ye shall be proved, by the life of Pharaoh ye shall not go forth hence, unless your youngest brother come hither. Send one of you, and let him fetch your brother, and ye shall be kept in prison, that your words may be proved, whether there be any truth in you, or else by the life of Pharaoh surely you are spies. And the test already seems to be working, because Judah is among those speaking in verse number 21. Chapter 42, verse 21, they said one to another, we are verily guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the anguish of his soul when he besought us, and when we would not hear, therefore this distress has come upon us. So the brothers tell their father about the requirement to bring Benjamin down. They go back home. They say, we have to bring Benjamin down, and Jacob refuses to allow it. In chapter 42, we see this as presented to Jacob. He says in verse 36, me have you bereaved of my children, Joseph is not, and Simeon is not, and you will take Benjamin away, and these things are all against me. And Reuben spake to his father, saying, slay my 2 sons, if I bring him not to thee. And he says in verse 38, my son shall not go down with you. So the eldest, Reuben, gives his promise. He says, let's take Benjamin with. We need to take Benjamin with. The guy in Egypt said we had to in order to get corn and survive. And if we don't, you can have my 2 sons. And Jacob has none of it. He doesn't trust Reuben. But they eventually, the food must run out even more. And in chapter 43, it's not Reuben who provides the surety. Chapter 43, verses 6 through 9, and Israel said, wherefore dealt ye so ill with me as to tell the man whether you had a brother? And they said, the man asked us straightly of our state and of our kindred, saying, is your father yet alive? Have you another brother? And we told him, according to the tenor of these words, could we certainly know that he would say, bring your brother down? And Judah said unto Israel his father, send the lad with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and thou, and also our little ones. I will be surety for him. And in verse 13 of chapter 43, Jacob allows it. And you know the story of the rest of this chapter. Joseph brings the men in, he feeds them a meal, and Benjamin receives a special favor there. In chapter 44, verse 2, Joseph has his cup put in Benjamin's sack. So when they leave, he sends somebody after them to chase him down. And in verse number 9, the brothers, being caught, say, hey, if that cup's found in anybody's sack, that brother will die. And in verse 12, it's found in Benjamin's sack. And notice who then becomes the focus of the narrative in verse number 14 of chapter 44. And Judah and his brethren came to Joseph's house, for he was yet there, and they fell before him on the ground. Notice how this happens. We talk about this sometimes in other passages. It's Barnabas and Paul, Barnabas and Paul, Barnabas and Paul, and all of a sudden it's Paul and Barnabas. That's kind of interesting how that switched around, the order there. Well, who are we talking about here? Is it Reuben and his brethren? No, it's Judah and his brethren here. Suddenly, Judah's the leader. And in verse number 15, and Joseph said unto them, what deed is this that ye have done? Watch ye not that such a man as I can certainly divine? And Judah said, what shall we say unto my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how shall we clear ourselves? God hath found out the iniquity of thy servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and also he with whom the cup is found. So Judah doesn't make excuses. He's been wrongly accused. He believes that God is now repaying the sin of the sale of Joseph. And this is a changed man from who we saw earlier. Following this, in the rest of chapter 44, is the emotional speech of Judah to Joseph, not even knowing who Joseph is. Judah, who had been involved in breaking his father's heart and pricked in his conscience, is now deeply concerned for his dad. He says, now therefore when I come to thy servant my father, and the lad be not with us, seeing that his life is bound up in the lad's life, it shall come to pass when he seeth the lad is not with us, that he will die. And this speech is so moving that it's what breaks Joseph. And he has to cry in chapter 45, verse 2, and reveal himself to his brothers because of what Judah has said to him. But what Judah says right before that shows how much he's changed since he sold his brother. In chapter 44, verse 32, for thy servant became surety for the lad unto my father, saying, if I bring him not unto thee, then I shall bear the blame to my father forever. Now therefore I pray thee, let the servant abide instead of the lad a bondman to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brethren. Let thy servant, let me, Judah, I will be the one who will stay here and give my life instead of Benjamin. Judah asked to be made a slave in place of Benjamin. In this, he's representing Christ, the innocent, for the guilty. He was a changed man. Finally, and I hope you won't mind, it'll take a bit longer, as we're running just a bit long to finish this story, let's tell of his legacy. We don't actually see a lot of the man Judah after this, though his descendants become very important in Israel. We see Jacob chooses Judah as the leader when his whole family moves down to Egypt. Genesis 46:28, he sent Judah before him unto Joseph to direct his face unto Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. But after that, the only time he's mentioned in Genesis is the blessing that Jacob gives to each of his sons before he dies. In Genesis 49, in verse number 8, it starts, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. Thy father's children shall bow down before thee. Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he couched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Binding his foal unto the vine, and his ass's colt to the choice vine, he washed his garments in wine, and his clothes in the blood of grapes. Now, a whole sermon could be preached, or multiple sermons, and they have been, on this prophetic blessing that Jacob gives to his son Judah. But let's notice just a few things. In verse 9, Judah is a lion's whelp, a young lion. Judah, and often this is interpreted as saying he's restless like a young lion, but really the biggest fulfillment of this is found in the book of Revelation. Revelation 5 through 6. And one of the elders saith unto me, Weep not, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, hath prevailed to open the book and to loose the seven seals thereof. So Judah, he was the young lion, but from his descendants would come the Lion of the tribe of Judah, Jesus Christ himself. In Matthew chapter 1, it says, and starting in verse 1, the book of the generation of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren, and Judas begat Pharez and Zerah of Tamar. And Pharez begat Ezram, and Ezram begat Aram. And the line goes on until it says, and Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, who is called Jesus, who is called Christ. Tamar was the one who made sure that Judah's line continued when he had two dead sons and one unmarried one. And in the end, Tamar made it into the New Testament in the line of the Messiah. Because if you look at verse 10 again, the scepter, chapter 49, verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. This is an important messianic promise. Judah's messianic heritage is attested to here. Judah's descendants would have the scepter until Shiloh come, which is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And this verse parallels well with the New Testament statement about the law. In Galatians 3:19 it says, Wherefore then serveth the law? It was added because of transgressions, till the seed should come, to whom the promise was made, and it was ordained by angels in the hands of a mediator. This verse in the New Testament says the law would remain in force until the seed, that is Christ, should come. And likewise, Jacob's prophecy over his son Judah said Judah would be the lawgiver until Shiloh come. Judah would be the ruler until a ruler would come from Judah. But Christ was not the only important descendant of Judah. There's other people that you know of that are descendants of Judah: Caleb, Boaz, Achan, and David. And Judah's tribe became one of the most important in Israel. Eventually, the nation would divide into two parts. One part was called Israel. The other part was named after him, Judah. And Judah was the more godly kingdom of the two. Eventually, Judah's name became so ubiquitous that it morphed into another word still used today to refer to all the descendants of Jacob, the word Jew. And Paul gives homage to this fact, actually, with a Hebrew pun in the book of Romans, which wouldn't be immediately apparent to everybody who might read that book, because he's giving a Hebrew pun to an audience who doesn't entirely speak it. But he says in Romans chapter 2, For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly, and circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. Did you catch it there? Whose praise is not of men, but of God. He's not a Jew who's one outwardly, but one inwardly, whose praise, Judah means praise, is not of men, but of God. And he refers to that same concept there, recognizing the root of the word Jew coming from Judah, which means praise. Now remember all the way back to the beginning when Leah names the little boy, her fourthborn, she named him Praise. And Paul mentions that here because of that very situation. He's not a Jew, which is one outwardly, but inwardly. Now what do we learn from Judah as we complete here? He's not a role model to be followed, but in the end we learn that somebody who starts wrong can repent and turn back to God and be used greatly by him. And one day, when you walk down the streets of the New Jerusalem, you're going to encounter one of the enormous gates that welcomes people in. And one of those gates, Revelation 21, verse 12 tells us, will be labeled with this name, Judah.